You're watching her hands shake as the silk robe slips from her shoulders. She's 13. The chamber smells of cedar oil and something else, something she'll later recognize as fear dressed as perfume. The man standing near the window is her father. She wants to call him that. Father, wants to believe that word still means protection. But the servants who prepared her body, who rubbed away every trace of childhood with scented stones, who painted her eyes to look older, who whispered instructions she didn't fully understand. They knew what that word means here. Property, instrument, offering to a god who wears a crown. This is Sparta, but not the Sparta you think you know. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. It genuinely amazes me that a story this dark, from so long ago, still finds people everywhere who need to hear it. This is the year 467 BCE. The Persian Wars have ended. Sparta stands as the supreme military power in Greece, having shattered Xerxes' invasion and crushed Athens' ambitions in the aftermath. The warrior cult that defined Spartan identity, the agoge, the phalanx, the code that made them legends, has reached its zenith. But there's another Sparta, one the histories barely whisper about. A Sparta where victory had a price that wasn't paid on battlefields, where the wives and daughters of defeated enemies became something historians would later struggle to name in their texts, because the truth was too disturbing to record plainly. Ancient sources, fragments from Plutarch, marginal notes in Thucydides, legal records preserved in Athenian archives hint at practices so systematically brutal that even rival city-states, who despised Sparta, hesitated to document them fully. What did Spartans do to the families of the men they conquered? What happened behind the walls of Spartan homes after the warriors returned with victory and with women who were not wives, not slaves in the traditional sense, but something in between, something the Spartans themselves had a specific word for, a word that has no comfortable translation. Her name was Artameisia. Not the famous queen, but a Greek woman from Messenia, a region Sparta had conquered generations ago and held through relentless suppression. Her husband had been a Messenian rebel, one of the men who periodically tried to throw off Spartan rule, knowing the odds were hopeless but choosing defiance anyway. When the rebellion was crushed, and it was always crushed, the Spartan response followed a template refined over centuries. The men were killed, not quickly but in public executions designed to humiliate. The children were absorbed into the helot system, the serf class that worked Spartan lands and could be killed by young Spartan warriors as part of their training in the crypteia, the secret war against the enslaved population. And the wives of rebel leaders, they entered a category Spartans called palaic andron, which translates roughly to concubines of warriors. But that translation is too soft, too sanitized for what it actually meant. Artameisia was 26 when they came for her. She'd been married for 8 years, had 2 children, had lived through 3 previous uprisings and their brutal suppressions, had learned to keep her head down and survive. But her husband hadn't learned. Or maybe he had learned and had simply decided that survival without dignity wasn't survival at all. When the Spartans executed him, crucified him actually, on a wooden cross outside the village center where everyone could watch him die slowly over 3 days, Artameisia had known her own fate was already decided. Spartan law was explicit. The wife of a rebel became property of the warrior who had killed her husband. Not a slave, which would have had some legal protections, minimal as they were. Not a prisoner, which could be ransomed. A palaic andron, a woman whose body and labor now belonged to a Spartan household, whose children would be raised as helots, whose existence served as a permanent reminder of Sparta's total dominance. The warrior who came to claim Artameisia was named Brasidas. He was 31, a member of the homoioi, the elite full citizens of Sparta, and already distinguished in combat. He had a Spartan wife, of course, a woman named Lampito, who had been selected for him by the elders based on bloodline and physical fitness for childbearing. Spartan marriages were not romantic partnerships, but breeding arrangements designed to produce strong warriors. Lampito had given Brasidas 2 sons who were being raised communally in the Agog system, and 1 daughter who remained in the household learning the austere virtues expected of Spartan women. It was a functional arrangement. Brasidas and Lampito barely knew each other, saw each other only for procreation and occasional household management discussions. She ran the estate. Spartan women had far more property rights than women in other Greek city-states, while he lived in the barracks with his unit, as all Spartan warriors did until age 30, and even after spent most of his time in military activities. Into this household, Artameisia was brought in chains. The walk from her village to Brasidas' estate took 2 days. She was not fed. She was given water only once. When she stumbled, exhausted, she was dragged. This was standard procedure, designed to break resistance, to make clear that her old life had ended and her new existence was fundamentally different from anything she'd known. When they arrived at the estate, Brasidas was waiting in the courtyard. He looked at Artameisia the way a farmer looks at livestock, assessing value, checking for defects. She was thin from the journey, bruised from the chains, but still young enough to work, still capable of bearing children if he chose to use her that way. He nodded to the overseer. She'll work the east fields during planting season, house duties otherwise. She sleeps in the slave quarters. If she resists, you know the procedures. The overseer did know. The procedures were detailed and had been refined over generations. A woman newly brought into a household as Palekandron was to be isolated for the first month. No contact with other workers, no opportunity to form alliances or plan resistance. She was to be worked exhausting hours so she'd be too tired to think. She was to be reminded daily of her status through small ritualized humiliations designed to destroy her sense of self. And after the first month, if she'd shown appropriate submission, she could begin integration into the household labor system. If she hadn't, if she'd shown defiance or attempted escape, the punishments escalated through carefully calibrated stages that rarely required killing her, because dead women provided no labor and no psychological warfare value, but that could inflict extraordinary pain and permanent disfigurement. Artameisia learned the system quickly because she had no choice. She woke before dawn and worked until after dark. She hauled water, ground grain, cleaned weapons, mended clothing, worked the fields during harvest. The labor was crushing but not unusual for women of her class. She'd worked hard her entire life. What broke her in ways physical labor couldn't was the psychological architecture of her captivity. She was forbidden to speak her husband's name. If she was caught weeping, she was beaten. She was required to serve meals to Brasidas and Lampito, to stand silently while they ate, to watch them with their children, to see the family life that had been stolen from her replicated in the household of the man who'd killed her husband. And once a month, sometimes more frequently, Brasidas would summon her to his chambers at night. These nocturnal summons were not secret. Lampito knew. The other household workers knew. This was not adultery in Spartan eyes, because adultery implied a betrayal of marriage vows, and what Brasidas did with his Palekandron was not considered a violation of his marriage to Lampito. It was considered his right, even his duty in some sense, because Spartan ideology held that strong warriors should father as many children as possible, and using conquered women for this purpose served multiple functions. It increased the Helot population that worked Spartan lands. It humiliated defeated enemies even in death by ensuring their widows bore children to Spartan masters. And it provided an outlet for desires that might otherwise disrupt the austere homosocial bonds of the warrior barracks. What happened in those chambers, what Brasidas did to Artameisia on nights when Lampito could hear through the walls but was expected to ignore, was rape in every meaningful sense, even if Spartan law didn't classify it that way. Artameisia had no ability to refuse, no legal recourse, no hope that resistance would be anything but futile and punished. She endured by dissociating, by letting her mind retreat to memories of her husband, her children, her life before, while her body went through motions that kept her alive. She became pregnant twice in the first 3 years. Both times the children were taken from her at birth and given to Helot foster families. She never saw them again. This, too, was standard procedure. A Palek-andron could not be allowed to form bonds with her own children, because such bonds might give her reasons to live beyond mere survival, might give her motivation to resist or rebel. But here's what the histories almost never mention, what emerged only from fragments and marginal notes. Lampito, Brasidas' Spartan wife, was not a passive observer of this system. She was its enforcer and its most ardent supporter. Spartan women were raised from childhood to value the state above all personal bonds, to see themselves as breeders of warriors first and individuals second, to accept any practice that strengthened Sparta's military supremacy. Lampito had been taught that her husband's use of conquered women was not betrayal, but patriotism, that Artemisia's suffering was not cruelty, but justice, that the children born from these rapes were not her husband's bastards but valuable additions to the Helot workforce. Lampito didn't just tolerate the system, she managed it. She determined when Artemisia would be available for Brasidas' summons. She inspected the Palek-andron regularly to ensure pregnancy or injury hadn't made her less useful. She administered punishments when Artemisia showed insufficient deference. This is where the story becomes almost unbearable, where we have to sit with a truth that shatters our comfortable narratives about gendered solidarity. Some women, given power within patriarchal systems, become more vicious enforcers than men, because they've internalized the ideology so completely that they see other women not as potential allies, but as threats or tools. Lampito was not unusual among Spartan wives in this regard. The sources mention multiple cases of Spartan women collaborating in the abuse of Palek-andron, not reluctantly, not with private guilt, but with genuine conviction that they were upholding civilizational values. Artemisia lived in Brasidas' household for 11 years. She watched Sparta win more wars, crush more rebellions, bring more Messenian and Helot women into similar captivity. She saw the sons Brasidas had fathered on her once, briefly, when they were working fields nearby. They were perhaps 9 and 7, didn't know who she was, had been told only that their mother was a Helot who'd died in childbirth. She survived by becoming numb, by letting the years pass without marking them, by finding small resistances that didn't bring punishment, moving slowly when not watched, stealing extra food, teaching younger Helot girls quiet songs in the old Messenian language that Sparta had tried to erase. And then, in 456 BCE, something unprecedented happened. A massive earthquake struck Sparta, destroying much of the city, killing thousands of citizens, creating chaos that the Helot population saw as divine judgment and opportunity. A massive rebellion erupted. The Third Messenian War, historians would call it, far larger and better organized than previous uprisings. For years, Sparta fought desperately to suppress it, pulling warriors from across their territory, abandoning outposts, calling up reserves. Brasidas was killed in one of the early battles, not heroically, not in a famous engagement, but in a border skirmish, struck down by a Helot spear in a fight that barely merited mention in chronicles. His death changed everything for Artemisia. Under Spartan law, when a warrior died without adult male heirs to inherit his estate, his property, including his Palek-andron, reverted to the state for redistribution. But the earthquake had created such chaos, and the rebellion had stretched Spartan administrative capacity so thin that enforcement of these laws became haphazard. Women like Artemisia, who had lived in captivity for years, suddenly found themselves in a strange liminal space, not freed, not legally autonomous, but not actively supervised as Sparta focused all resources on crushing the rebellion. Artemisia did something that archival records suggest was rare but not unique. She ran. Not to freedom, because there was no freedom for a woman with her legal status, but to one of the rebel-held zones where Messenians were temporarily autonomous and where her status as widow of a previous rebel gave her credibility. She was 37, marked by years of labor and abuse, carrying trauma in her body and mind that would never fully heal. But she could speak, could testify, could tell other Messenian women what happened in Spartan households, could provide intelligence about Spartan practices and vulnerabilities. She became, in the final years of the rebellion, a kind of witness, not a fighter, not a leader, but someone whose survival and testimony mattered to the resistance movement's understanding of what they were fighting against. The rebellion failed, of course. Sparta crushed it with characteristic brutality after years of grinding warfare. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were sold into slavery outside Sparta's territory, a rare admission that even Sparta couldn't absorb more helots after such massive unrest. And women like Artemisia, women who'd fled their captivity to join the rebels, were marked for special punishment. The records are fragmentary, but they suggest mass executions, public tortures designed to terrorize any future resistance, systematic elimination of anyone who might carry memory of rebellion forward. We don't know exactly how Artemisia died. The most reliable source, a fragment from a later Athenian historical compilation, mentions that women who had fled their masters' households and joined the Messenian uprising were crucified along the roads leading to rebel territories, their bodies left to rot as warnings. That's probably what happened to Artemisia, a death designed to mirror her husband's execution 11 years earlier, bringing her story full circle in a way that's almost unbearably symmetrical. But here's what survived. Testimony. Not from Artemisia herself, but from Athenian sources who interviewed refugees from the rebellion, who documented Spartan practices as evidence of their rivals' cruelty, who preserved details about the Pallic-Andron system that Spartans themselves rarely wrote about explicitly. These accounts were fragmentary and motivated by political bias. Athens and Sparta were enemies, and Athenians had incentives to portray Spartans as barbaric. But the details are too specific, too consistent across multiple sources, too corroborated by what we know of Spartan legal structures to be dismissed as mere propaganda. The system existed. It was systematic. It destroyed thousands of women across generations. And it was considered completely legal, completely normal, completely consistent with Spartan values that modern people often romanticize when they think of warrior culture and discipline. What did Spartans do to the wives of defeated warriors? They broke them systematically, not through random cruelty but through carefully structured practices refined over centuries. They used them for labor and reproduction. They denied them legal personhood and family bonds. They made their suffering visible enough to terrorize other subjected populations, but kept the detailed mechanisms just obscure enough that later historians could tell stories about Spartan virtue without confronting the full horror of how that virtue was maintained. They created a system where even the wives of Spartan warriors became enforcers, where women oppressed women in service of state ideology, where survival meant complicity and resistance meant death. The ruins of ancient Sparta are sparse compared to Athens. Spartans built little, left few monuments, preferred to be remembered through reputation rather than architecture. You can walk through the site today and see almost nothing of the city that once dominated Greece. The barracks are gone. The training grounds are gone. The estates where women like Artemisia labored and suffered have left no trace. But the texts remain, fragmentary and disturbing, preserved in Athenian archives and later compilations, testifying to a system that treated human beings as instruments and called it justice. Artemisia was one woman, but she stood for thousands, Messenian women across multiple generations, Helot women caught in Sparta's internal suppressions, women from other defeated city-states who were absorbed into Spartan households and disappeared from history except as marginal references in documents about property and labor. They had names, families, lives that mattered to them even if they didn't matter to the system that consumed them. Their suffering was not incidental to Spartan power, but essential to it. You cannot maintain a society where a tiny warrior elite dominates a massive enslaved population without systematic brutality, without practices designed to break resistance before it forms, without using the most intimate violations as weapons of social control.